You know, there's a passage in the Bible that says that the Lord will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear, but in every situation will make a way of escape. Well, I had an interesting opportunity to see him at work in his humorous way yesterday. As a Tennessee fan, I was watching the Tennessee-Alabama game, and right after halftime, a car hit a pole. That's not the humorous part. Nobody was hurt, I'll go on and say, but a car hit a pole, and our whole neighborhood lost cable. And it came on right after the end of the coverage, literally minutes, probably 2 minutes after the end of the coverage. The cable came back on. So the Lord kept me from having to watch that whole second half. So I just want to say a public thank you to him. Because the first half was we might have been in that territory of tempting me beyond what I could bear. Might have had a hole in my TV. Okay, I started last week a series about trajectory. Trajectory means the path followed by a projectile flying or an object moving under the action of given forces. And I talked about last week there are a number of these. Some of them are within our control and some of them are not. But our life has a trajectory. In other words, a trajectory is basically where you're headed, right? Shake your head so I can hear it rattle. Your trajectory is literally the direction we're headed, and all of our lives have that. Now, obviously, things change that. Forces change that. Some of them are not in our control. They can be good things or bad things. But where we're born. Geography matters. If you're born in a third world country versus if you're born here in the land of plenty and opportunity. If you're born to a family that values certain things, education and is financially stable, or if you're born into a family maybe that has different values and different viewpoints. Other things, even bad things like accidents or the huge percentage of children that are molested and things like that. All of these things affect your trajectory, and a lot of them we can't control. But I wanted to talk for a couple of weeks about something that affects our trajectory just about as much as anything, and it is something we can control. And that is our relationships, our friendships. You know, they say you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. We can pick our friends. And so these relationships around us. And last week I just talked about the importance of having friends and the fact that 25% of Americans today say they literally do not have one single close friend. And the average American 25 years ago said they had 5, and now the average American says they have 2. So we have somehow kind of lost this, either the art of friending or maybe it's seeing the value in it. But I talked last week about the value of it. Andy Stanley said, your friends will always determine the direction and quality of your life. And that's basically saying your trajectory is largely determined. You remember, if you weren't with us last week, one of the things that sociologists have come up with and that a particular speaker that I was talking about calls the average of 5, the law of the average of 5. And it says you will be basically like the average of your 5 closest relationships. And we last week listed our closest friends. And if you look at that list, often you are. We're kind of in the middle financially or even spiritually. There's a couple of our close friends, maybe we'd say, boy, they're really on fire. A couple of our friends that we'd say, man, they're really kind of not. And somewhere in the middle, we call it moderation, but somewhere in the middle, we place ourselves. And we find that we are often sort of the average of the people we're around. Now, where last week I talked about how important it was just to have friends, I want to deal with that a little differently. A few years before Andy Stanley ever said anything, King Solomon put it this way: walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. So who we hang out with matters. In fact, we've been using a little bit of a phrase in this series that says, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And if you have children, particularly if they're teenagers at this point, or they ever were, which they probably were, you totally get this, because they said all the same things all their friends said, right? And their values their political views became the same. In fact, sometimes I heard something interesting the other day that's a great example of this. 96% of Americans believe there is some sort of God, including 50% of atheists. Now that kind of made me scratch my head and go, Isn't that what atheist means? But in fact, what that means is they're indoctrinated by the people around them. Even though they claim to believe one thing, they're indoctrinated by the beliefs around them. So, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. Now, we're more concerned, or we're more connected than ever before, yet many of us struggle with this feeling that something's missing. It ought to be better than this, right? Life ought to be different than this. There ought to be something more. Solomon explains part of it, and it's a spiritual issue when he says in Ecclesiastes 3 that God has placed eternity in the human heart. As long as we are in this temporal and this human lifespan, we realize there's something else out there. But there's something else too. And sociologists list 3 different kinds of poverty. The first one is material poverty. And we kind of all know what that is. I have it. It seems like. Why are y'all so quiet today? Material poverty just means lack of resources, lack of wealth, lack of a good home. I mean, we have homeless people in our own city. Lack of the resources and possessions and things like that to live a comfortable life. But there's a second kind, and that is spiritual poverty. And that is the kind of poverty that comes that even though you have the basic necessities, even though you have the things, you might have all the material wealth in the world, you still have no spiritual hope. And it's why we find the suicide rate is higher among wealthy people as we do among poor people. Because hope isn't just based on what your resources or your material wealth is. It is also based on this hope of spiritual hope, of there's more than this. There's something beyond this. The rich young ruler is a good example of this. The rich young ruler comes and meets Jesus, and he says to Jesus, what do I have to do to be saved? What do I have to do to have a relationship with you is really what he said. And Jesus said, obey the commandments. You know them? And the guy says, sure, I know them, and I've obeyed them since I was a kid. And Jesus said, that's great. One more thing, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Now here's what I'm after in it. And it says the young man walked away sad. Or as my sisters would correct me, sadly. The young man walked away sad. Now here's what's got me scratching my head. He was no less rich. He didn't say, okay, here you go, let me grab my checkbook. He walked away as rich as ever, yet sad. And so material wealth is not enough. There's spiritual poverty. And there's one other kind of poverty that sociologists point out, and that is called relational poverty. And this might be the type of poverty by which we're the most impacted. And if you've ever been to a third world country, whether on a missions trip or a humanitarian trip or just on your travels, you've seen this and you instinctively picked up on this, and that is they live in tremendous material poverty. They live in homes that you wouldn't spend one night in. They walk wherever they go. They don't have the right kinds of medicine, the right kinds of nutrition. Most of the nations in Africa, you find an average lifespan of 40-something years. They don't have long lifespans. They don't have anything. I've often referred back to a trip a number of years ago, and when we stayed in Kenya, their homes were made out of these bricks. Well, they were bigger than bricks, but they were like concrete block size. But they were a mix of mud and cow manure. Now imagine living inside cow manure. And here's what you find, though, when you go to those third world places. They are spiritually wealthy. Their relationship with God seems so much more real. They say things like, it won't rain, we'll just pray. If you say, well, what if it rains? What we'll do? They go, it won't rain, we'll just pray. And you go, why didn't I say that? Why did he have to say that? They have great spiritual wealth and they have great relational wealth. Their families matter, their friends matter. They give. They don't have anything and they still give. They bless you 5 times as much as you bless them when you're among them. And so what we have to recognize is while we might not suffer from material poverty or spiritual poverty, maybe you have a strong relationship with the Lord, it's still possible to suffer with relational poverty. One major contributor to our relational poverty here in the U.S., because it is real, anytime you realize that 1/4 of our population doesn't have one close friend, it's a real thing. A major contributor is the shrinking size of our families. 50 years ago, the average family had 3.5 kids. Now, I don't know what half kids look like, but I look at Debbie and I realize this is pretty accurate. She was one of 4, I was one of 3, so we're right down that little middle line, 3.5 kids. The average family today now has 2. Now, that may not seem like a huge deal until you take it one step further. And the average person had 20 first cousins 50 years ago. The average person today has 4. So you see the exponential effect of almost 50% less children per family when it begins to reach the families of siblings, and their 3.5 becomes 2, and then their 2 only have 2, and you see this exponential effect, and suddenly we don't have big families that we're surrounded by relationships with people that know us well and have the freedom to speak into our life, good or bad, have the right to say almost anything to us because they're kin to us, and because we already don't like them, so who cares if we get mad? It's particularly troubling in view of a study called the Grant Study that was done by Harvard University. And they tracked subjects for 75 years. That's a long study. The main conclusion was that strong relationships are the most important ingredient to well-being over a long life. So I want to challenge us today to examine not just are there enough relationships in our life, but to look at a few key relationships. In other words, you could be one friendship, one relationship away from achieving the things in your heart. You could be one friendship away from breaking decades-old, generations-old substance abuse issues in your family or abuse issues in your family. You could be one key relationship away from growing spiritually into what God has put into your heart. You could be one key relationship away from fulfilling God's will and destiny in your life. So I want to take a guy that I refer to quite often because he's one of my very favorite characters in the Bible. But I want to take King David and I want to look at 3 key relationships in his life. And then I want to ask us, do we have these 3 key relationships in our life? Because maybe we're lacking one of these relationships, or maybe we're lacking all 3 of them. But if we're strategic about building relationships, we understand the value of relationships. We understand that that if we walk with the wise, we'll become wise, that our friends are literally our future, then it's time we are honest about this and strategic about this. Now, can one friend make a difference? Before I talk about David, let me talk about another guy and how much one relationship changed him. A guy named Saul of Tarsus. Acts chapter 9 tells a story. He's on his way to Damascus to arrest and punish and persecute Christians. And Jesus confronts him, blinds him, knocks him off his horse, and calls him to become a Christian and even says to him, you're going to be my chosen messenger to carry this message. And Paul would go on to carry it to the world, where the men that Jesus had mentored, many of them mainly at first stayed centered in Israel and to the Jews. Paul would be the one that would see this worldwide vision. Here's the problem. Paul goes on into Damascus and began to do ministry, and then he went back to Jerusalem. Now, he was from Jerusalem. He had been trained at the temple there under a Pharisee named Gamaliel, who was well respected and known. And so Paul was known in Jerusalem. What he was known for was being zealous and being just absolutely unwilling to bend at all in this persecution of the Christians. So he comes back, and I'm going to pick it up in verse 26. When Paul comes back to Jerusalem, he says, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing he was really a disciple. But Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles, and he told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of the Lord. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. In other words, one friend changed the entire trajectory of Paul's life. Paul wasn't accepted by the church. Why? Well, they had watched him stand by while Stephen was stoned. They had watched him arrest people and drag them away into jail. They had seen him be cruel. They had seen him be heartless. They had seen him be absolutely determined to find every one of them, to eradicate this whole movement. And now he comes back and says, hey, I'm one of the guys now. They're looking at him going, we're not so sure. And Barnabas staked his reputation, staked his name to this man and says, it's okay, he's with me. I'll vouch for him, I'll stand for him. And this one friend changes Paul's entire future, his entire destiny. Now, out of David's life, I want to talk about 3 friends he had, because I think I see 3 different types of relationship that all of us should have in our life if we're going to reach our full destiny, if we're going to increase our trajectory. 3 relationships we should have. The first person is Samuel, because we all need a friend who makes us better. Now, the first time we see David and Samuel together, what's going on is God has rejected Saul, different Saul, as king of Israel, and has said to Samuel, go to this man named Jesse's house in Bethlehem and anoint one of his sons. I'll show you which one. So Samuel does. Samuel goes to Jesse's house, and he sees the first guy, Eliab, and he is handsome and tall and looks like he could wrestle a gorilla, and he must be the one. God says no. Second one, he's pretty impressive too. No, 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 no. He even looks at the dog. No. And finally, Samuel says, I'm confused here. Are these all the sons you have? And Jesse says, well, no, I got this one runt. I didn't think much of him, so I didn't want him to come in and stink the place up because he's been hanging with the sheep. Samuel says, go get him. Nobody thinks anything of David. Otherwise, you wouldn't have uninvited him from the king anointing party at your house. And so when he comes in, the Lord says, this is him, rise and anoint him. First of all, the Lord says, stop looking on the outside, Samuel. I look on the inside. This is my guy. Rise and anoint him. And verse 13 of 1 Samuel 16 says, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. We need friends that make us better. There's an old saying, misery loves company. And you'll find it. If you've ever been in a workplace that had multiple employees, you knew there was the chronic complainers group. They always managed to find each other. You could put them on opposite ends of the building. You could put them in different departments and on different shifts. And they were going to talk. And they were going to talk about you if you were the boss. But there's something else I noticed too. Not just misery loves company, because the worst salespeople when I was in the car business were always over there together, and they were always talking about how the advertising was bad and how the manager was bad and how I was bad and all of this. But I found something else. Success loves company too. I found that the people at the top tended to hang together. And we need friends that challenge us, that see something in us, that make us better than we are. I've told many of you guys, it was friends in my life. I can point to the ones that marked the way for me, including my pastor, who said to me, there's more in you than you see. There's more in you than you're getting to right now. I think the Lord wants to do more with you than you're doing right now. I wasn't saying that. I was pretty comfortable. It was him saying, nudging me along. And I can point at people and go, that person made me better. There was a guy I traveled with years ago when I was playing music, who we all took turns praying. I've told some of you this story, but this is the power of your influence. We all took turns praying, and so we would sit together, the 4 of us, and a person would lead prayer each time. And 3 of us prayed very much alike, like we were making a speech to God. O Lord God, thou that sittest enthroned among the cherubim and that rideth upon the, we prayed in Old English even though none of us were from England. And Steve prayed like he and God were sitting on a couch. And they were friends. And over the course of months and years, I began to realize, I want to pray like that. Because I want God to be my friend. I don't want him to be a guy I make speeches to. When I need help, I need a friend, not somebody to make speeches to. When I'm confused, I need someone I think cares, not someone who's waiting on me to get all the words right in my prayer. And he changed the entire approach to prayer that I had. Because he never one time said, here, let me teach you to pray. And I never one time, like the disciples said, teach me to pray. I just was around him. And I was around this person that had an intimate relationship with God, and I realized I didn't. I had a head knowledge relationship. It was the same way with worship. Worship was all about, did they get all the notes right and the words right and the songs right, and did they pick one I like, and was there a key change at just the right moment so that I got those little chill bumps on my arm because I had to feel it. Then I realized I was around true worshipers that realized worship's an act of the will. We should set our will and our mind to, I will worship God, because I'm a high priest that carries the presence of God on my shoulders. Peter called us priests, which means I'm responsible to walk into a building not hoping the presence of the Lord is there, because doggone it, if it's not, I failed. I'm supposed to walk in with the ark on my shoulders. Whether I am on front of the stage or whether I'm on the back row, I should never leave a service going, that was the driest, deadest thing. Boy, the Lord wasn't within 100 miles of that place, because shame on me. But it was only by being around true worshipers that worshiped when they didn't feel like it, that worshiped when the answer didn't come or the wrong answer seemed to come, that worshiped when it was the worst music, the worst talking, the worst preaching, and it didn't even seem to matter. And it changed me. We all need friends that make us better. Not just true in spiritual issues. We need them in life. We need people. There was one of my good friends when I was about 6th or 7th grade. I became friends with another guy named Danny, who was 3 years older than me. And so he could drive, I couldn't, which meant we went the places he went because we was kind of like he. What was really cool about that is he and his older brother had a group of guys they'd been playing basketball with for years that had all played at the same school I went to, but long before me. Several of them had already finished college even. And they played every Sunday afternoon. And he started taking me along, and I was the worst. I mean, I was 14 years old, and many of them were in their 20s. And it seemed like every pass I threw, they knew where I was throwing it before I threw it, and they stole it. And it seemed like every shot I took, they blocked. And it just seemed like I was the worst person there. And everybody, I know they're rolling their eyes when they're picking teams like, somebody's got to have him. The point was I was 14, and I was around people that made me better. And when I began to play again with people my age, I realized, wow, I'm better than I was. And I'm better than a lot of them because they've been playing at this level, and I've been playing over my head, and I still wasn't better than those guys, but the gap closed to where at least they picked me occasionally on their team. The point is, this is true in every area of life. You want to have a great marriage, be around people that their marriage is better. You want to raise great kids, be around people who raise great kids, who have great family values, whose kids reflect the values you'd like for yours to. You want to be a great prayer, be around someone who knows what it means to know God intimately and personally. You want to be a great worshiper, be around someone with a revelation of God that's beyond yours. Because our worship is a product of our revelation. If you know this much about God, your worship is this wide. The great thing about God is you will never exhaust the subject, so your worship will continue to grow. But it's about being around people who make you better. The second type of friend David had is a guy named Jonathan. Jonathan was his age, and we all need a friend who helps us find spiritual strength. Now, fast forward a little bit in David's life. He's been anointed king, but he's not king, because Saul's still alive. And Saul kind of has gotten the word that David's going to be king, and Saul's jealous of him. And it didn't really help when David killed the giant that Saul didn't want to fight. And it got worse when the girls all came in town singing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. So David's on the run for his life from Saul and his army. He's got a few men, which the Bible describes as broke, in debt, discontented, and kin to him. I think all of those might mean the same thing, but at least all the ones kin to me. No, I'm teasing. Which, by the way, I'm glad to have my cousin Ramona with me today. What was I talking about? Does anybody know? Jonathan. So David's on the run from Saul. He's hidden from this army that's chasing him. But Saul's son Jonathan, in spite of the fact he should resent David more than even Saul, because Jonathan's the heir to the throne, Jonathan loves David. Jonathan comes and finds David while he gets away from Saul and the army, even though he's Saul's first officer. He sneaks away and he comes to David. And in 1 Samuel 23, verse 15, it says, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. That's a bad day. I've probably taught some bad messages, and you've probably thought about it, but nobody's ever yet tried to take my life here. Verse 16, and Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. We all need someone who strengthens us spiritually. Someone who says to us, you know, the Lord's going to provide. When we look at the empty checkbook, they're going to tell us, I know what you're thinking, I know how you feel, but here's what I found is God is always, always, always faithful. David became this later for others when he said, I was young, but now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaking or their seed begging bread. David needed spiritual strength, because I'm going to tell you what David was thinking, because to a lesser degree, we've all thought it. Now, nobody's chasing most of us around to kill us with a whole army. But here's what we've thought. Lord, I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be anointed king. And I was 16 at the time. And David waited 24 years before he actually reigned. So I don't know exactly how long he'd been on the run there, but he'd been on the run for years. And he's going, Lord, right now my life was a whole lot better when it was me and a bunch of sheep, because none of them wanted to kill me. And, you know, why? And if this is you, and if this is your will, why is it not working so well? And you've prayed that prayer, I'll bet you. And I've prayed that prayer, maybe this week, no, I'm teasing. We all pray this prayer because we go, Lord, I don't get it. I am trying my best to listen to you. I am trying my best to do everything I can find in your word. I read through your word. I look, I go, okay, there's a principle. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not consciously doing anything except trying to follow your will. So why is my nose bloody about half the time? Why do I keep running into brick walls? And that's what David's saying. And Jonathan could have come and just put his arm around him and said, there. Or he could have come and said, you know what? You shouldn't have been so cocky and, you know, killing the giant and all that. There's 100 things Jonathan could have said, but what Jonathan said is, the Lord will provide and you're going to be king and I'm going to actually be your assistant. He strengthened him. He strengthened his spirit. And it's the same thing that happens for me when one of you guys calls me during the week and says, man, I just want you to know I was praying for you. And you know what? I feel like the Lord wanted me to say this to you. I don't know what this even really means, but the Lord said, I think he's saying this to you. Or I think maybe you consider this. Or I found this verse today. It made me think of you. We need people around us that strengthen us spiritually, that encourage us to be spiritual, that encourage us to live and feed the spirit, not the flesh. Because Paul says it comes down to who you're feeding, the spirit or the flesh. And if you feed the spirit, you won't fall victim to the lust of the flesh. But if you feed the flesh, your spirit's going to stay stunted and impoverished. We all need friends who encourage us in that way, because there's plenty of other stuff around us that's not spiritual, right? On our televisions, in our workplaces, on our computers, on our phones, on our iPads, on anything you look at the movie theater. There's all kinds of things that weaken us spiritually. There are all kinds of things that actually strengthen or feed the flesh side of us. And I'm not suggesting we shut ourselves off from that, because there's a whole big world of which 5 billion people are lost. We need to be right in the middle of all of that stuff. But we need to be spiritually strong enough to go there. which means there needs to be friends in our life that strengthen us spiritually, that encourage us to go further, that encourage us. Did you read the Word today? Did you pray today? That come to us and go, God is not through with you. I don't care if you're 80 or 90. God is not through with you. God wants a new thing, a new season. He doesn't ever let go. You're not past your prime. You're not too far gone. We need someone that says to us, you're more than this spiritually. It encourages us to focus on our spirituality. And the third friend was a guy named Nathan. We all need a friend who will tell us the truth. Now let me preface this with saying, you can have terrorist friends. You can have friends that tell you the truth as long as it's always negative, and they tell you what all you should have done and could have done and how you could have done it better and how much smarter than you they are. Ditch those puppies. You don't need that. But you need a friend that will tell you the truth, because there are times you're wrong. I know that's surprising. I've had to come to terms with that too. There are times you're wrong. David, God's man, by now God's king, never lost a battle, sees another man's wife, decides, I think I might like to know her a little better. Takes this other man's wife, has the man murdered, hides it for a year. First of all, can we agree that there wasn't only one person in all of Jerusalem that would have known this? Because like there was a baby coming. But there was one man who came to him. Prophet Nathan came to David. And he told David a story. It went kind of like this. He said, David, there was a really rich guy and a poor guy. This rich guy had all kinds of flocks and farm and all this. This poor guy, he had one little lamb. Just one little lamb. But he didn't treat it like livestock. This was a pet. This lamb literally slept in the house with him. This lamb was like, these kids played with it, and it sat in his lap, was like a domesticated pet to him. He loved this little lamb like his own child. And one day a friend came to visit the rich man. The rich man decided he'd make a big feast for him, but instead of going out and killing any of his hundreds of sheep, he goes and takes this one little lamb from the poor man, breaking his heart, breaking his children's heart, slaughters this lamb and feeds it to his guests. David's righteously indignant, shall we say. Says that man deserves to die and he'll repay fourfold. And Nathan looks at him and says something that could have quickly made him headless. He says, you are the man. And if you go back and read Psalm 51, you find David's response. Create in me a clean heart, renew a right spirit in me, forgive me, for I am a sinner. But finally, somebody loved him enough to tell the truth. Say, you are that man. Now, as I said, this only works with friends that love you and that speak encouraging words to you. This isn't only friends that's all they do is tell you what all you've done wrong. Those aren't friends. I'm not sure what those are, but those aren't friends. But when you have a friend that loves you and encourages you and always is telling you all the good stuff about you and all of the good characteristics and all the things God wants to do with you and how thankful they are for you, when they do look at you and say, you're wrong this time, we accept it. My former pastor was my greatest supporter and gave me opportunities, saw things in me I didn't. But there were days too where he looked at me and went, you know what? You're a funny guy. It's not that funny to everybody. There's times he said, your background is hanging with the guys. And it's poking fun. And if you love hugs from me are cut downs. I mean, I'm not real comfortable with the whole hugging thing sometimes. So if I'm picking at you, I like you. That's just my natural. If I'm not picking at you, I'm just not talking to you. If I don't like you, I'm just not talking to you. And so I'm having to work through some things. But he would tell me every so often, like in front of the whole choir, I'd crack a joke at somebody. He'd go, that person might not have gone home thinking that was that funny. And it wouldn't have bothered me, but I needed him ever so often to say, you need to dial that back a little bit. There had to be somebody in my life that could point it out. And one day, because at first, I'll be honest, I did what you would imagine I would do. I go, he just doesn't understand. People know me, know my personality. And then one night after a choir rehearsal, a lady that actually I knew very well, we had a good friendship. She and her husband and Debbie and I were all good friends. We kidded about each other. Our birthdays were one day apart and everything. And somebody came to me after choir practice and said, do you know she left crying? And it didn't even register with me. I had no idea why. I was just picking, and I didn't do anything that my friends would have done it times 10 to me. But I didn't think anything about it. It wasn't personal. It wasn't anything really. To this day, I don't know what was offensive about it. But I called her, and she said, it really wasn't even what you said. It was the day I had. And at work, all kinds of issues. And I got there, and it just felt like it pointed me out. And I finally heard what my pastor had been saying to me about what you can say with your friends and the picking and all that. When you say that in front of a group of people, everybody there assumes you'd say that about them or to them. I had to learn there's a whole lot of times. You may not believe this, but I actually do bite my tongue a lot. Because I don't bite it nearly enough, and I know you know that. But the point is, I really do. And I had to learn that by, unfortunately, not being willing at first to hear, you need to dial that back until it hurts somebody. Fortunately, he was a good friend, and we are still friends, and she loves Debbie and I, and we love her, and all of that. But it just as easily could not have ended that way because I was a little too hard-headed to hear a friend that said, you are the man. Not, you're the man, but you are the problem. In this case, you were wrong. I also, though, was more willing to hear that from him because he was also the one that said, I think you could do this. I'd love to see you try this. Here's an opportunity to do this. This was a person that I knew loved me. And so we need a friend in our life that will tell us the truth. And sometimes the truth isn't bad. Now, Nathan had a bad message this time. But we need a friend that will tell us the truth when it's good. You're better than this. You can do this. Here's an opportunity I think you ought to take advantage of. We need that person who will actually maybe put their finger in our face a little bit and say, here's what you need to do, or here's what you did, or here's what's wrong with that. The fact is, some of us will never become all that God wanted us to be because we're relationally impoverished. If we go on, the average person now has 2 close friends. We go on with 1 or 2 friends. It's not what God intended. Jesus came to earth and gave us a pretty nice model. He went and found friends and said, come live with me, walk with me, have breakfast with me, fish with me, preach with me, teach with me. Let's just hang out. And he didn't pick 1 or 2. He picked 12. Now that's a lot. But it is emblematic of the fact that we are not called to be loners. He sent the disciples out 2 by 2. We don't do well as loners. The very first observation God ever made about a man, other than it was very good, was it's not good for him to be alone. Still not. We're not made to be alone. But as long as we are relationally impoverished, we'll never reach our full trajectory. We'll live these lives where we know something's missing. But the problem is we don't know what's missing. The reason we don't know what's missing is we're a product of the people around us. It's missing for them. So we live lives that are spiritually shallow. We live lives that are not committed. We live lives that are lukewarm. We live lives that are centered on accumulating more stuff, on having more experiences. We live lives that don't ever accomplish the destiny God's given us because we are surrounded by those that are living those kinds of lives too. And we may be one friend away from changing our destiny. We may be one key relationship away from breaking patterns of abuse that have gone back to parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. We may be one friend away from healing our marriage. We may be one friend away from reaching those dreams that God has put in our heart. We may be one key relationship away from becoming the parent that we always knew we could be, but for somehow we haven't been. And even more importantly, because this is almost all of our testimony, you may be one friend away from meeting the King of Kings. Because most people meet Jesus not stranded or marooned on an island alone. They meet him through someone else, through a friend. 80-something% of people that attend a new church don't come because of a great advertising campaign or a direct mail piece or a pretty sign out front, even though all of those are good and all of those help. And I wish we had all of those at even greater numbers. But they come because somebody said, why don't you come with me? Somebody they loved, somebody they trusted, somebody they felt like had their best interest in mind, wasn't just trying to get a check mark on a roll, said, come to church with me. You might be one relationship away from eternal change. Now, here's the tricky question. How do we find that relationship? How do we find that key relationship? This might not be what you were expecting me to say. Proverbs 18:24 says, a man that has friends must show himself friendly. So I guess my question is, are you being a friend who makes people better? Are you being a friend that helps others find spiritual strength? When they're mired in depression, discouragement, why won't it go right? Instead of going, oh, I know, my life's terrible too. You give them spiritual strength. You speak words of hope and faith. Are you a friend that will tell the truth? And please hear me. The truth's not always bad. If you've got a friend that everything you need to tell them that's true is bad about them, you got a lousy friend. Let me just start there. But if are you a friend that makes others better, that helps others find spiritual strength, and that will tell the truth? Because if you are, you're on your way to finding those key relationships because, as I said, you may be one friend away from changing the entire trajectory. You may be one Barnabas away from changing the entire trajectory of your life, to accomplishing things you can't even imagine right now, because maybe that friend that makes you better will see them in you. Maybe that friend that helps you find spiritual strength will help you overcome that thing you've never been able to overcome. Or maybe that friend who will tell you the truth will point out that one area that's holding you back that you can't see, because we all are a little bit of a blind spot owner. Let's bow our heads. I'm going to pray with you. Lord, I thank you that you are patient with us, because it seems like, at least for me, it takes me a long time to figure out that when you came to earth, you modeled how a Christian should live. And you surrounded yourself with relationships. And you made those around you better. And you made them spiritually stronger. And you told them the truth. You told Peter, you're a rock, and I'm going to build a church on you, and I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom, and nothing can prevail against you. You also told Peter, get behind me, because you're always in my way. And you see things with eyes of flesh, not eyes of the Spirit. Lord, help us to be those kinds of friends for others. I pray you would lead us into relationships and communities of friends that will help us to be better, that will push us, that just by being around them, we will rise. But Lord, I pray that we would also have a heart to be a mentor, to be a friend, to be a spiritual help to those around us. Lord, give us the heart to be a friend. Most of all, Lord, may we remember that you are a friend that sticks closer than a brother. You are the one friend that never turns your back on us, that always makes us better as we read your word, as we see the portrait of you emerge in the Gospels. What we see is a challenge to be better, a challenge to be spiritually stronger, and a challenge to take the truth, the sword of truth, and carry it with us. If there is one here today, Lord, that doesn't know you, I pray that this would be that moment that they say, there is more to life, and I've got to have it. I've lived without long enough. I've lived life long enough, and you've said that true life is in you, and I want that today. Let's stand. We're going to do one last song. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes while we do that to think about what we've talked about, to talk to the Lord in your own way without me doing it for you and you wishing I'd hush. Give you just a moment to talk to him in your own way and give you a moment to worship him, because everything, every relationship in our life should be built on this one thing, this cornerstone that is Christ.